that can stop me inside this octagon, and only politics can slow me. I don't have much left to say other than you have seen nothing yet.
It's time!
You're listening to the Cage Nation TV Prizefight Podcast. Coming to you from the Coastal Cameron Studios in Willington, North Carolina.
Are you ready?
Here's your host, the big fella, Albert Cameron.
Let's get it on!
Thank you for joining us on this week's Prizefight Podcast. I'm your host, the big fella, Mr. Albert Cameron. And before I get started, and whatever I'm about to get started in, if you're listening to us on YouTube, make sure you click the crap out of that thumbs up button. Make sure you subscribe, because when you subscribe, the Prizefight Podcast, Cage Nation TV and Cage Nation TV South comes to you, my friends. We're doing all the hard work. Okay, you get to be the deadbeat in this relationship, and we are going to be that loving partner that's going to carry you, because we think you're going to change. Because we think we can change you, that you are just going to change because you love us. And guess what? We're never walking away. We do this because it's a labor of love. We bring you content every week because I can't imagine what else I would do every week if I didn't have the Prizefight Podcast and CageNationTV.com. I truly, truly love it. And so make sure you click like, make sure you subscribe, because that's going to help us do this kind of stuff for a living, ladies and gentlemen. That is the goal. For me to do this for a living. Coming up this week on the Prizefight Podcast, I am having an existential breakdown. I am questioning everything over the past couple years of what I do and what my intention has been. I've decided to interview myself in a way. I'm going to be taking a look at some burning questions that have been eating away at my brain because I can't drink, so I need anxiety to do that for me. It's eating holes in my brain, and I'm finally going to get them out. They're on paper right now. We're going to get them out in the microphone. I don't know what's going to happen, truth be told. It could be cathartic, or it could be a cluster F. You'll have to stay tuned after the messages to find out. It's the Prizefight Podcast. Don't go nowhere.
This week in MMA history.
This week in MMA history, February 26th through March 4th. March 3rd, 2012, UFC on Fox, Alves versus Kampman. The UFC holds their 200th event in Sydney, Australia. The event was the first UFC card to ever host flyweights as part of the flyweight tournament to crown a flyweight champion. Also on March 3rd, 2012, Strikeforce Tate versus Rousey. The first iconic battle between Rowdy Ronda Rousey and Miesha Cupcake Tate occurred in Columbus, Ohio. Rousey would go on to defeat Tate in 4 minutes 27 seconds of round number 1 and never be defeated as Strikeforce Women's Bantamweight Champion. The company would close, and Rousey would be named UFC Women's Bantamweight Champion. March 3rd, 2011, UFC Live Sanchez vs. Kampman. The UFC holds its very first event in Kentucky at the KFC Yum Center in Louisville, Kentucky. The bout was headlined with the main event of Diego the Nightmare Sanchez versus Martin Kampman, with Sanchez getting the unanimous decision. March 1st, 2008, at UFC 82 Pride of a Champion, the UFC Middleweight Championship and the Pride FC Welterweight Championships are unified when Anderson the Spider Silva defeats Dan Henderson by rear naked choke. Mark the Hammer Coleman, former UFC heavyweight champion, is inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. February 26, 2006, at Pride 31 Unbreakable, in a bout between Mark the Hammer Coleman and Mauricio Shogun Hua, Hua broke his arm defending a takedown from Coleman. When the referee went in to intervene and stop the fight, Coleman pushed the referee aside and continued to brawl. The slight from Coleman ignited a brawl between the Hammer House and Shootbox. The New York badass Phil Baroni and Vanderlei Silva most notably scuffled in the fracas. March 3rd, 2007, at UFC 68 Uprising, the UFC holds its first ever event in the state of Ohio. In the main event, former UFC heavyweight and light heavyweight champion Randy the Natural Couture came out of retirement and was able to capture the UFC heavyweight strap once again by getting a unanimous decision victory over Tim the Maniac Sylvia. Welcome back to the Prizefight Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Mr. Albert Cameron, and I cannot thank you guys enough for coming back. I have to believe mostly because you guys want to see what it's like to see a big guy just kind of lose his shit. And if you ever watched the TV show The MMA Rundown, I would do it every now and again on a little segment called What's Eating Albert Cameron. And I went back and watched a couple of those. And good lord, if you guys still watch the MMA Rundown after that, You're either my mom, really love the sport of MMA, really good friends of mine, or just really had nothing else to do. Because, I mean, I went off on some real stupid stuff. I really did. I really let some words fly that... As soon as they invent time travel, I'm going back and I'm slapping that pudgy bastard upside the head and saying, hey, knock it off. Before I do get into my descent into madness, or it could just be another snooze fest, if you watch the MMA Rundown, you know that sometimes what eating Albert Cameron could be. I definitely want to give some props. Props specifically to the Bionic Fist of Justice, Mr. Dan Kakuda, to the Death Star Kamal Worthy, and the Lumberjack, Greg Rudolph, all successful in their boxing matches last night in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for the Pinnacle Boxing Championships. And you know what? If you see Matt Leishak, give that man a high five. Because let's be honest, that man has brought so much combat sports to the Pittsburgh area that we all get to readily enjoy. Okay, that man stakes his personal financial future every time he puts on a card. And if the card doesn't do well, there's no insurance for that. There's no insurance policy you can buy to say, hey, just in case the fight sucks, you're still going to make your income. No, he puts his personal assets on the line every time he promotes an event. So if you see Matt Leishak, make sure you high-five him. Of course, we're always looking forward to combat sports coming back to the Pittsburgh area. And we want to thank those folks for letting us have involvement in those combat sports. Coming up this summer in the North Carolina, South Carolina region, Battle in the South is going to be putting on an event here in Wilmington. Another one at the Wilmington Convention Center downtown. Gorgeous venue. Love it. I'm getting familiar with some guys who are fighting here regionally, and that is awesome. I'm very happy about it. Next Level Fight Club will be putting on a card in Raleigh in May. That is awesome. And I'm told that Team MMA Battle, that's right, Team MMA Battle should be promoting in Myrtle Beach in June. Now, Team MMA. Is that what it sounds like? Yes, it is. Two guys fighting two guys. It's awesome. And we're actually going to be talking to the owner of Team MMA Battle about his unique concept and why he's doing what he's doing and how it's an applicable change to combat sports. And hopefully, for you fighters who listen to the Prizefight Podcast, maybe we'll have some information on how you and your buddy might be able to compete in the Team MMA Battle arena. We won't know until we actually sit down and talk to the man, so I'm not going to make promises. But certainly some really fun and exciting stuff coming up in the southern region of the southeastern United States. So, I woke up today, and clearly I need some rain and misery in my life because it was beautiful here this weekend, and I feel like I have accomplished nothing. Woke up this morning, made some coffee, BS with my wife, and then she went to the beach to go shell hunting because that's what she does and she's very good at it. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to get on it. This is going to be my day. I'm going to truck some stuff out. So then I just end up making a sandwich, laying on the couch and watching the couple episodes of The Ultimate Fighter Season 2. Why Season 2? Why not? Because that's the best answer I've got. Season 2 wasn't even remotely close to my favorite season, but that's the one I was watching. I was being reminded that Jason Von Flew got some stitches in his face. That's pretty much what I accomplished. So I started scouring news for things that are important. And there are some important things going on. There are some stuff that's happening in the world of boxing, with Manny Pacquiao getting an opponent. And of course, I don't want to talk about McGregor versus Mayweather. Because by the time the words leave my mouth, they're inaccurate again. They're not current. So, I don't really want to go through that. Of course, MMA is happening some stuff, but I think it's pertinent to note that boxing is making some very important moves. Canelo Alvarez is talking about fighting during Cinco de Mayo weekend, which would be huge. Canelo Alvarez, of course, a native of Mexico. There's talking about he's going to fight Triple G, which they've heard that one to death for the last couple of years, ever since he was going to fight Miguel Cotto. So that got me thinking about, okay, well, what's going on in the world? What's happening with boxing? Boy, this sandwich is really good. Man, Matt Hughes was a real dick to Jason Von Flew. Boy, the sky is blue. Water is wet. Sand is itchy. Like, that's the stream of how things are happening here. Okay, I'm no doctor, but I might have a touch of attention deficit disorder. And that just shows you how old I am that I call it ADD and not ADHD. And I have no idea when they added the H, but I'm feeling they're selling a different medication for it. And that's a very expensive H. So I'm sitting there thinking, man, what's going on I'm thinking about Canelo Alvarez is going to fight Triple G. I'm thinking, hey, my boys from Pittsburgh are kicking ass in the boxing ring. And then that got me thinking about the first boxing event I ever saw live in person. Now, I've had the good fortune, the blessings of being able to see quite a few fights live in person. And it wasn't because of my doing. It's because there are a lot of gracious fight promoters who are very motivated and encouraged to develop their fight circuits. And they allow some guy that they've never met most times, named Albert Cameron, from a website called CageNationTV.com, who has a web video, and he wants to create content based around that. I did nothing to get the good fortune of going to these fights. It's because these promoters are gracious enough to allow me to be at their event. Now, for this particular fight, I can't remember how I got in, but it wasn't. Cage Nation TV hadn't been born yet, but the MMA Rundown was. Did we go for the MMA Rundown? Drew, if you're listening, send me a text, because that's going to drive me crazy. Anyway, Drew and I are live at the Blair County Convention Center. We're seeing Valley Fight League. It's January 19th, 2013. We're seeing Valley Fight League at the Jaffa Mosque for their Broad Avenue Brawlers series, which I thought was great. And I'd love to see him come back. I think promoters of all types should be in Altoona, Pennsylvania for one reason or another. But Broad Avenue Brawlers is happening in Altoona, Pennsylvania, and it was a boxing card. And again, if I could go back in time and slap that pudgy bastard around saying, hey, pay attention, knucklehead, I absolutely would. I didn't appreciate boxing then as much as I do now, and that in itself is the tragedy. Now, I remember the main event sticking out in my head, and I said, man, I think the one guy got cheated pretty bad. And this is one of the first opportunities that Rob Lynn and I have ever had to sit down and talk about combat sports, because Rob's a fantastic photographer. And if you are a promoter of any sort and you can get a hold of Rob Lynn for his services, I highly recommend you do so. Go check out his portfolio at roblin.org. So before that, I didn't have an opportunity to talk to Rob Lynn about stuff. And I said, hey, I think the one fighter got cheated. And Rob Lynn said, well, why do you feel that way? And I said, well, from where I was sitting, I felt that he outclassed the other guy. Now, you have to understand, at this point, the only understanding of the striking arts that I have is MMA striking, which I've been over it time and time again, that just because you're a good striker in MMA doesn't always mean that you're going to be a great boxer. So Rob Lynn has his camera, and he says, well, I saw it a little differently. I'm like, man, that's cool. I'm glad Rob was here to tell me that. I'm glad he was able to change my perspective. So one of the first burning questions I had was, what happened to the main eventer that I think got the poopy end of the hot dog stick? And why is it a hot dog stick? I couldn't tell you, because I'm losing my shiz today. That's why it's a hot dog stick. So I go looking, and you got to understand, I'm trying to figure out who this guy is. I have no idea what his name is. All my resources that I use to find out fights is MMA based, so I have no idea how to find this fight. So I Google Valley Fight League Altoona, PA. Could it get any more broad? Well, no, but kudos to Valley Fight League, because they do keep their old boxing cards. And I found out that the guy I thought had been cheated, his name was Andres Taylor. And Andre Taylor fought a guy by the name of Harvey Jolly. I thought Taylor was winning that fight. Let's chalk up a victory. One, I was able to find out his name, because that was killing me. I thought his name was Vargas for some reason. No, it was Andres Taylor. He fought Harvey Jolly. Taylor out of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And I'm like, man, this guy has to be President's champion by now. But it looks like Taylor has not fought since March of 2015. He had some really good bouts with Rayford Johnson, Al Sands, Denton Daly. Was not able to recapture the momentum of what he carried into the fight with Jolly. Before Jolly, he had a win over Justin Howes, dropped a loss to Garrett Wilson, but then had a ridiculous winning streak. And I'm like, man, this guy has to be it by now. Like, he's got to be with it. And no, it wasn't quite what he was happening for him. What it did prove was that I've been right about a couple things. And if you're listening, Sarah Cameron, wife of Albert Cameron, I'm right And this is probably the one and only time you cannot stop me from saying that. I am right, woman. I take that woman part back. That was incredibly insensitive. But I'm right. But what it proved was how important it is to pay attention to the guys who are fighting, because you never know, you're going to be laying on the couch watching The Ultimate Fighter wondering, why is Jason Von Flue getting 40 stitches in his eye whenever George Gurgel busted him open? And you're going to be asking yourselves these questions. If you see a fighter that catches your eye, you should certainly follow his career. Appreciate combat sports for what they were. But I'm breaking out my pen. That's the clicking noise of my pen. And I'm checking off that question. Whatever happened to Andre Taylor, the guy who lasted Valley Fight League in the main event in January of 2013? I don't know why that question was burning in my face, but it just was. The next question I had to ask myself was, Mr. Albert Cameron, you big fluffy sumbitch, do you prefer the ring or the cage? If you guys remember when I talked to Ken Shamrock, and that was a huge ordeal for me. Let's not be mistaken. When I got to talk to Ken Shamrock, that was a huge ordeal. I'm still a huge fan of the world's most dangerous man. Let's not mince words, okay? It's like being a lifelong fan of the Cubs. I'm a huge fan of Ken Shamrock. Always will be. I asked him, Ken, do you prefer the ring or the cage? He said, I prefer the cage because the cage does not allow for the stalls that the ring does. And he's right. The ring was ultimately designed for boxing. In the world of MMA, whenever the fight hits the ground, fighters are scrambling near the ropes, there's the opportunity that the fight has to be stopped. And that's, anywhere between 5 and 15 seconds of the fight, stalls. Ask yourself this, how many deep breaths can you take in between 5 and 15 seconds? Enough to recover somewhat. I probably know when to give exercise or diet advice to, but you can probably take a couple good deep breaths, maybe recover a little bit. When it comes to photographing and videoing the action, I feel like the ring takes it hands down. Super Brawl just recently hit Fight Pass, and there's a lot of unpolished things about Super Brawl. But if you get down to what the core of what Super Brawl really is, Super Brawl is a lot of guys who went on to do bigger and better things. It's like watching their college football tapes. And I equate the early King of the Cage events to that exact same thing. Early college football events, you get to see fighters doing what they're doing before they're doing it. And it is what it is. Pride FC held their events in a ring. Oh, Lord. Rumble on the Rock, BJ Penn's family's promotion, I believe, held events in the ring. Pancrase, Shudo, all in a ring. Early Dream fights were in a ring. So, do I prefer a cage or a ring? Cage looks daunting. It really does, but for some reason, I just feel like I really enjoy fights in a cage. In a ring. I think back to some of my favorite fights, some of my favorite fight moments. Some of them were in a ring. So, I need to separate myself from that emotional attachment, from that endearment. And then ask myself, okay, do I prefer a cage or a ring? So the best way I figured out how to answer this question in the most unbiased way possible was, Albert, if you were going to start a fight promotion right now, would you buy a ring or a cage? Boom. Clarity. It all makes sense now. It's all clear. That is the clarifying question. If I were starting a promotion right now, would I buy a ring or a cage? The answer is, I think I would buy the ring. I have this interesting concept in my head of a fight promotion that does it all. Kickboxing, boxing, grappling, MMA, any competitive combat, man-on-man sport. I would like to do that in a fight promotion if I did. I have no interest in being a promoter. Promoters work extremely hard, very little thanks, but let's correct that right now. Thank you, promoters, for everything you do. Being a promoter can sometimes be a very thankless job, but if I were to do it, I would want to buy a ring because I think it would look cool. I think it would serve the purpose as well. Valley Fight League, and if you're listening and you can go to a Valley Fight League fight, it's I don't know how he did it, but it's awesome. He has a boxing ring that turns into an MMA cage, and it's something to see. It's pretty cool. But what it comes down to is I think I prefer the ring over the cage, even stalls considered. I think it allows for fights to be seen differently. It allows for better views. It adheres to tradition in some sort of sentimental way. So that answers that question. I prefer a ring. And we're just going to go ahead and check that off. When we come back from the break, I'm going to talk about who I think is the greatest of all time, what is the worst fight promotion I've ever seen, and I'm going to answer the question of which do I prefer, UFC or Pride. Don't go nowhere. It's the Prizefight Podcast. Cage Nation TV would like to take a second and formally thank all of the businesses that have taken the time to sponsor a mixed martial artist or a boxer as they have trained to attain greatness. In the world of business, it can be looked at as an advertising expense to get your name out there. But did you know that your sponsorship dollars is actually keeping the American dream alive? Your help and support is actually changing the lives of aspiring athletes. Working hard and reaching for the brass ring is truly the great American story. We encourage all of our listeners and followers to support businesses that sponsor your favorite fighters. And thank you to those businesses for your continued support and encouragement. Welcome back to the Prizefight Podcast, and good lord did I go over my time on that last one. And I told you that's what happens when you let Hot and Fluffy here go off on whatever tangent he's going to go on. So I have 5 planned questions. I got through 2 of them. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. The greatest of all time, the GOAT, the GOAT. Who do I think is the greatest of all time? It comes down to 2 schools of thought. It could either be Anderson the Spider Silva or the Last Emperor, Fedor Emelianenko. Emelianenko had some wonderful bouts. Kevin Randleman. Fedor got suplexed on his head by Randleman, a very thick, sturdy wrestler he was, and Fedor woke up, but got up and proceeded to pummel Randleman to the point of he could no longer compete. Fedor fought Crow Cop, he fought Heath Herring, I think. Just a list of who's who in the heavyweights in Japan. Of course, Anderson the Spider Silva jumped on the scene by scoring one of the most highest connection ratios that a striker can score in the middle of a fight. I think it was like something ridiculous, like 82% on the side of the skull of Chris Lieben. Chris Lieben was talking smack. Anderson Silva took it personally and began to pick Chris Lieben apart until Chris Lieben was down and the fight was over. Silva went on to score some awesome wins, eventually getting a match and rematch with Rich Franklin, to which he took that title away from Franklin. Of course, that title being the middleweight championship. Anderson Silva, the longest reigning UFC champion to current history, and he recently got a win over North Carolina's own Derek Brunson that was a little bit mired in controversy. So now the question is, who do I think is the greatest of all time? What I think it boils down to is the quality of competition over the levelness of playing field. Fedor Emelianenko, an incredible heavyweight champion, but I think Fedor also competed at a time when heavyweights weren't the most favored competitors in all of MMA. I mean, I'm trying to think of a more delicate way to put that, and I really can't. Fedor was the king of the heavyweights at a time where heavyweights didn't have the star power. I mean, the UFC had Andrei Arlovsky, and the Pride had Fedor. And whenever those two eventually met, they weren't exactly at their peaks, but Fedor ended up knocking Andrei Arlovsky silly. But then you got to look at some of the heavyweight competition that Fedor fought whenever they came over to the UFC. They did not do so well. So I think when we compare evenness of playing field and quality of competition, I think Anderson Silva has competed in the better fights against better opponents. Every middleweight that came his way, Anderson Silva absolutely destroyed. It got to the point where Anderson Silva was even changing weight classes, taking a couple fights at light heavyweight against James the Sandman Irwin and Forrest Griffin, and even Stephan Bonner to try to get quality fights. And Anderson Silva was destroying everyone that was in front of him. We can always talk about, steroid allegations. Okay, well, let's talk about that for a second. Yes, steroid allegations certainly draw a black eye, but it doesn't always mean that someone's guilty. I'm always willing to give a competitor the benefit of the doubt that maybe he was taking a supplement that he didn't know contained a banned substance, or perhaps it was for a very good medical reason like Cyborg had. The steroids show up, you take your ban, pay your fine, and you don't do it again. Everything being equal and opposite, Fedor might have been involved with an organization that shall not be named on the show. Quality competition. But coming down to it, and for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and say that officially I'm changing camps. I think that Anderson the Spider Silva is the greatest of all time. But in an interesting note, I also think we have a new greatest of all time coming down the pipe shortly. Every era should have one. In boxing, it was Muhammad Ali, then Mike Tyson. The Klitschko era happened. Of all time, of course, is very broad, like of all time. But that was Fedor, and now I think Anderson Silva has dethroned him. Albert, what is the worst fight promotion you've ever seen? Well, I have seen quite a few. I can tell you that they are none locally or regionally. I think all the promotions in every area I've been to cover for a press event, I think they've all been stellar acts. I think they've all put on quality fights. I think as business people, they are all run extremely fairly. I've also seen some really bad ones because I used to collect MMA DVDs, and I've seen some ones that were shining examples, ones that could have made it, ones that didn't quite have the business knowledge to get where they needed to go, and then there were the exceptionally bad. If I had to put the label on it, it's not even really an MMA promotion because I define MMA as a sport that has rules, a sport that has required equipment, required uniform, consequences for breaking those rules. Competition, that is what I view as a sport. I think MMA is a sport. If I had to put the label of worst promotion I've ever seen, it's not an MMA promotion, but an NHB promotion. NHB, of course, standing for No Holds Barred. That promotion being Rio Heroes. Rio Heroes was a promotion in Brazil that was running events when MMA is trying to get sanctioned in a bunch of states, and it was a bunch of people who were fighting with bare gloves. And if you've ever gone to like a nursery, you know those puzzle mats, that they put down for kids to play on? That they had a mat that was pretty much made out of that stuff. Okay, and a cage that was up against the wall. It was just a real hokey looking operation. And what really pissed me off the most was people were like, dude, bruh, that's like the real competition, man, okay? All holds, all techniques are legal, bruh. Okay? They're not even wearing gloves, bruh. They're not even wearing gloves. Okay, yeah, we've been there. We did that. It was called UFC 1. You are, 10 years too late to the table to grab a chicken on that one. Rio Heroes, I think, was really, really counterproductive at the time. I thought it was garbage. A fight is a fight. The human hand is not designed to punch the human head. That's why gloves were implemented. That's why the rules we know and have them are the way they are, so that people don't get hurt. And when you're fighting bare knuckle for the sake of fighting bare knuckle just to prove how tough you are, well then, please stop wasting my oxygen at the end. The last question I have written down for myself is an old one that probably should have been answered 15 years ago. Do I prefer the UFC or Pride? Kind of answered that already whenever I talked about who do I think the greatest of all time is. Is it Anderson Silva or Fedor or Emelianenko? It comes down to a couple aspects. Presentation. Well, Pride had the UFC beat. I mean, the Pride intros that they borrowed from professional wrestling, I think really set them apart as an MMA promotion goes. I think Pride did wonderful, wonderful, wonderful things when it came to pageantry and presentation. During the dark days, the UFC had two options. Can we compete with Pride in the terms of production value? No. So they went the opposite direction. We can't compete with Pride with production value, so we're just not even going to try. They stuck to fights. And the UFC had an opportunity, a challenge that the Pride didn't have to deal with. When Pride and UFC were going head-to-head, the UFC not only had to compete with Pride, but UFC also had to compete with government. UFC is trying to get legalized so that they can bring the fights to the fans, where Pride didn't have to deal with that. Pride, as far as I knew, did not have to deal with athletic commissions the way the UFC did. So the UFC had something of a handicap going into that fight with Pride, with competition, and UFC still come out ahead. What it comes down to was who promoted longer. Well, the UFC did. Who is still promoting today? Well, the UFC is. Well, but what about Rizin, Albert? What about the Rizin Fighting Federation? No. It is not Pride. The UFC won whenever the UFC bought Pride. Now, I'm not asking who was the best promotion by numbers. Who do I prefer? And for the longest time, it was Pride. I thought Pride was awesome. But as I'm looking back now, and I'm seeing that Pride fighters aren't as successful coming over, maybe there was a little bit of bias involved. Maybe Pride didn't have the best fighters. Maybe Pride had the best presentation, but not the best fighters. And as I'm discovering these things, as I'm seeing them for myself, I'm realizing that I think the UFC has had the superior product all along. And I'm not nut hugging. I'm not trying to score points with Uncle Dana, but the facts don't lie. Numbers don't lie. Whenever Pride Fighters came over to try to compete in UFC level, Pride Fighters were unsuccessful. And you can say, well, what about Anderson Silva? I do not qualify Anderson Silva as a Pride fighter. I consider Anderson Silva a Shudo fighter that competed in Pride, who then became a UFC fighter. That's a long argue over minutia for another day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining me today while I'm getting a bunch of stuff off my chest. I think it turned into a really good discussion if it was not anything antiquated. These questions should have been answered a long time ago. So hopefully by the time next week rolls around, Mayhem gets arrested again, or something bold and tremendous happens that I can talk about. Today I think was just a really good day to get some things off my mind and off my chest. Coming up next week, well, I have no idea. Make sure you check out CageNationTV.com for the Friday 5, the return of the Friday 5. We are counting down some pretty cool stuff about where you can get your fix of fights for free. So head on over to CageNationTV.com for that. And make sure you click that like button. Make sure you subscribe. Tell your friends to subscribe. If your grandma is sitting around with her iPad watching a bunch of stuff, make sure you click the like and subscribe for her, because frankly, she'd want you to. She would want you to bring this golden voice to her every day, every week. I'd do it every day if I could. If I get paid for just talking about the fighting every day, I'd do it. I wouldn't think twice, I'd do it. All right, so we'll see you guys next time, and until next time, fights Cameron, action. Thank you for tuning in to the Cage Nation Prizefight Podcast. All rights reserved, 2015-2016 Planetary Sports. The Prizefight Podcast is part of the Cage Nation Broadcast Network. For more information, visit www.cagenationtv.com.